Back from an impassioned speech at the UN about the threat Iran poses to the world, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu spoke to an audience in Israel at Bar-Ilan University. Shockingly, though, the speech wasn't a bunch of fear-mongering about Iran. No, Bibi actually took the time to talk about Palestine, but maybe not the way you'd hope. See, using references to Palestinian leadership in the early 20th century, Bibi actually tried to link today's Palestinians to the Nazis of the 1940s. Yet despite this harsh rhetoric and the abysmal conditions of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, America's political support for Israel remains strong. So here to help me break down this issue further, I'm joined by Max Blumenthal, a journalist who's been exploring the cultural and political shifts within Israel, and the author of the best-selling new book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Max, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, and just to clarify, the new book isn't a bestseller yet, but
it will be.
Your viewers can help me.
Awesome. Well, Max, you talk about multiple forces that are driving this base of support for Israel within the U.S. What are they?
Well, obviously, there's the Israel lobby. AIPAC, which is the key arm of the Israel lobby, is one of the most powerful forces driving support for Israel in the United States, but also there is sort of a curtain of silence around the facts on the ground, what Netanyahu seeks to obscure in his own backyard. And what I want to do with my book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Israel, is break that curtain of silence and get behind the veneer of propaganda that's been erected in this country. Now, you mentioned Netanyahu's speech at the UN in New York, and then him going back to Israel, to Bar-Ilan University, which is the academic base of religious nationalism in Israel, and spending 15 minutes ranting about how the Palestinians are the heirs to the Nazis and how the Palestinian national movement was directly engaged in the final solution and the killing of Jews in Europe, which is completely false. But beyond that is pure incitement. He delivered this speech in Hebrew, and meanwhile the U.S. is trying to conduct a peace process with Netanyahu. Under Netanyahu's terms, this man is supposed to be a partner for peace who's calling Palestinians Nazis. So you see him speaking one language in the U.S., saying he wishes for a peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians, and another language in Israel. And in my book, in my chapter about Netanyahu, I call him the salesman because I talk about his marketing efforts of Israel in the U.S. I write about a little-known quote that he delivered at the same university, Bar-Ilan University, in 1989, where he talks about how he urged then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, and he was in Shamir's government, to begin conducting a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in the occupied territories because the world's attention was focused on Tiananmen Square in China and the protests there. Now Netanyahu has the world's attention focused on Iran, and this is part of his strategy to continue conducting human rights abuses and crimes in his own backyard, away from the world's attention.
And Max, as we know, up until recently, there was actually a eugenics-style program administering birth control forcibly to Ethiopian Jewish communities, unbeknownst to them. Can you speak about the discrimination within Israel against African Jews and asylum seekers?
Yeah, you mentioned something that is a disturbing story about the kind of abuses that are meted out to Ethiopian Jews, and this occurred in a transit camp run by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, where women were given Depo-Provera shots without knowing, which suggests that the government of Israel wanted to limit the number of black babies, even if they were Jewish. But what we see in Israel increasingly, and especially in Tel Aviv, is a massive campaign of racist incitement and violence against the 60,000 non-Jewish African refugees who have made these harrowing treks across the Sinai Desert, fleeing violence in regions like Darfur, in places like Eritrea, fleeing repression. And they had heard that Israel was a country that was honoring the legacy of the Holocaust and cared about refugees. And instead, increasingly, by the hundreds and the thousands, they're being placed in a camp in the Negev desert in the south of Israel called Saharonim, entire families, including women and children, for as long as 3 years, a camp that the Israeli architectural collective Bikrom has called a concentration camp with harsh conditions. And they're being placed there not only because they're migrants who aren't citizens of the State of Israel, but because they are non-Jews who cannot become citizens of the State of Israel, because the only path to citizenship is in Israel right now is to be like me and to have J-positive blood.
Max, there's a chapter in your book that also talks about the institutionalized discrimination within the country. Can you just elaborate on some of the policies that exist that exemplify this kind of state-sponsored discrimination?
Yeah, I mean, I could spend the rest of your show or the rest of the evening talking about that, but one thing that's worth mentioning that has been ignored in the Western media, especially in the U.S. press, is that a recent Israeli Supreme Court decision ruling against petitioners calling for an Israeli national identity. In other words, Israel is probably the only country in the world that has no national identity. Instead, identity is afforded according to your ethnicity, Druze, Arab, Jewish, and your rights and privileges are given to you based on your ethnicity. And if you're Jewish, you have superior citizenship privileges. Now, since the foundation of the State of Israel, there has not been a single village, town, or city built for Arab citizens of Israel. Meanwhile, in the Negev desert right now, where 80,000 indigenous Palestinian Bedouins live in unrecognized villages, where they're not allowed to hook up to the electricity grid, even though electricity wires run over their villages. They can't get any public services because they're not Jews. There is a plan called the Prover Plan that will forcibly relocate 40,000 of those indigenous Bedouins to state-run Indian reservation-style towns, which, according to a government-linked website, the Or Movement, have been built to concentrate the Bedouin population. This will be the largest campaign of ethnic cleansing, possibly, since 1948. And you have to wonder, why aren't we hearing about this in our media? What I'm trying to do with my book, Goliath, is just simply educate people and get past this curtain of silence that obscures human rights crimes like the kind we're discussing now.
Absolutely. I wanted to get your opinion on this. Recently, I was talking to Norman Finkelstein, and he was saying that Obama's kind of trying to reinvigorate the peace process because he's failing politically. How much of the peace process do you think has been just completely co-opted and turned into a meaningless political tool?
I think it's been kind of a meaningless political tool since the beginning, and we have to note that there has never been a U.S. proposal for a Palestinian state. Now, I know that sounds kind of ridiculous because we're constantly talking about a Palestinian state, but a state means you're allowed to have a military. A state means you're allowed to control your borders. A state means you're allowed to control all the territory within your borders. In a state, you get airspace. You get to control your water resources. And according to the U.S. plan, the Palestinian Authority is entitled to absolutely none of those. Especially control of its own borders, and it will receive only a small portion of the land that it was originally entrusted with in the Oslo Accords 20 years ago. Since the Oslo Accords, 150,000 settlers have been moved into the West Bank by the State of Israel. So it's basically a joke, and what Obama and John Kerry are doing is buying more time so they don't have to make a decision and ring the alarm on Israeli apartheid. Israel is using the peace process or the talks, and Netanyahu says he's committed to peace talks, with the operative word being talks, to continue building more settlement units while the Palestinian Authority is locked into this timetable and can't do anything. So it's not only a charade, it's a dangerous exercise which is leading to increasing human rights abuses and colonization beneath the rhetoric of peace.
Right, and of course, I mean, actions speak much louder than this meaningless rhetoric that we hear time and time again, president after president. Israel's obviously the third rail in American politics. You simply cannot question the Israeli government's policies without being labeled certain things. How can we get anywhere with this issue if the world community won't even push back against Israel's violations of international law? We have about a minute left.
I think we're seeing people talk about it more. I think we're seeing the debate shifting, and I think we're increasingly seeing the Israel lobby exposed as a paper tiger. The more people who are willing to challenge it, I think, the more we're going to see a tidal wave of resistance in favor of a humanitarian solution to the Israel-Palestine crisis. And the center of this, at the bottom of this tidal wave, is the Palestinian-led BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which I cover extensively in my book, Goliath.
Absolutely. Journalist Max Blumenthal, crucial issue. We need to put the pressure on and get this story out there. Everyone check out the book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.